It's exhausting just listening to that. Did I really go through all that? Yeah, well, you know, one of the co-authors actually was Ray Bradley, who's a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, which is actually the town where I grew up. And in fact, I used to, Paul Mange, who helped arrange this, this event here today, was also a high school classmate of mine. I knew Ray's son, Steve Bradley. He was a classmate of mine at Amherst High School. So Ray Bradley was one of the co-authors as well, and the three of us, Ray Bradley, Malcolm Hughes, and myself, were subject to this sort of fishing expedition. And when you listen to sort of the Climategate, this sort of fake Climategate scandal, there's some interesting things there. These were emails that were stolen, and excerpts were used to try to discredit individuals, myself and others, in the lead up to a very important political event, the Copenhagen Climate Summit of 2009. WikiLeaks and Russia both had a role in publicizing those stolen emails. So if this sounds a little bit familiar to you, it's because of the thing that we're, you know, the sorts of attacks that we're now seeing deployed writ large at the very center of our politics today, in some sense had their start in this disinformation campaign that was waged by fossil fuel interests who didn't want to see progress made in tackling the problem of climate change in Copenhagen. Interesting subtext. So skip ahead to the last presidential election, Russia, WikiLeaks, stolen emails. And increasingly, we now think that what was at the center of that was a $500 million deal between Russia and ExxonMobil, the world's largest fossil fuel company, to joint venture to mine $500 million worth of Russian oil and fossil fuel reserves. Who was appointed to be Secretary of State? Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil. Over the next year or so, I think we will be subject to some fascinating information that is likely to come out that suggests that, in fact, the very same players and factors that were behind that attack on climate science back in 2009 were behind the attack on our democracy that played out in the last election and continues to play out now. So these are very large forces. The fossil fuel industry is the world's most powerful and wealthiest industry, and they don't want to see us, you know, move on from what George H.W. Bush referred to as our addiction to fossil fuels. And they have used the resources, the tremendous resources available to them up to now to block progress. I think that things are changing now. And we have sort of alluded to earlier, you know, we're sort of going through a cultural tipping point right now when it comes to the way we view you know, gun laws in this country. There was a time when we didn't think it was possible to make progress on this issue. But all of a sudden, you know, these high school students, these Parkland High School students, up against the very same forces, multi-billion-dollar special interests, in this case the NRA and those who are allied with them, and somehow these high school kids have managed to seize control of the narrative when it comes to gun control. And we're going through a tipping point right now as a result of that. And that gives me optimism that we have the potential to go through another cultural tipping point on issues of environmental sustainability and climate change. And it may be that, you know, the atrocities that are taking place today under the current administration and Scott Pruitt's effort to dismantle a half-century of environmental protections that were put in place by Republican and Democratic administrations alike. I think that that is leading to the same sort of outrage that is likely, in my view, to result to another cultural tipping point when it comes to issues of environmental sustainability and climate change. So I remain cautiously optimistic despite the overwhelming forces and the huge, immense power and wealth behind this disinformation campaign, which I and my colleagues have found ourselves at the center of to block progress in dealing with climate change. But I've pontificated enough already. What we were envisioning here today was a discussion. I already pontificated today at Berkshire Community College, and I spoke for the better part of 45 to 50 minutes. And then we had a wonderful question and answer session thereafter. I'm hoping we can continue that now. So thank you very much. Let's talk about this. Yeah.
I actually have two questions, but I can start with one and we'll see where we go.
And can folks introduce themselves? Just say something about you. That'd be great if people.
My name is Uli Nagel. I'm also a member of Living the Change Berkshires, and I'm so excited to have you here. I saw you, amongst other things, in the movie Merchants of Doubt, which was such a revelation and very entertaining too, but also chilling to the bone.
Yeah.
I can only recommend it. So one question I had was, I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby, who is a bipartisan organization working on carbon fee and dividend legislation in Congress. And apparently, like ExxonMobil and Shell have signed on to the idea of putting a price on carbon in the way of a fee and dividend. And I was just wondering from your perspective, some people are cynical, say this is just greenwashing, they just want to look good. Other people are saying, well, actually, they have an interest to do this because they need to explain to their shareholders to actually change their business model, and if we had such a fee, that would build a case. So I was just curious if you have any take on that. It's like a little bit out of the climate science, but obviously you have a lot of experience in that.
Yeah, no, I was forced out of the laboratory a long time ago, so I'm happy to talk about the larger picture. I spend most of my time doing that these days. And I think there are enlightened actors within the fossil fuel industry, within the energy industry. For a time, BP seemed to be leading that effort. And then, of course, we had the Deep Horizon's oil spill disaster at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, and that sort of impaired their ability to present themselves as a paragon of environmental sustainability, and they sort of moved away from that. ExxonMobil has a shadow price of $60 per ton of carbon, which is twice what the Obama administration had indicated as the social cost of carbon. So there is a recognition, that ultimately there will be carbon pricing. What I think the disinformation campaign, which ExxonMobil has been a part of as well, is delaying that. Delaying that so that they can sort of position themselves rather than fall behind the rest of the energy industry, which is already moving on. In other countries, we are seeing a pretty dramatic move away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. We're seeing that worldwide, a little bit less here in the US. So I think ultimately what this has always been about is stalling and buying time. They know what the end game is. ExxonMobil knows what the end game is. They know that they have potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in stranded assets, and that's become an important part of the conversation as well. Bill McKibben, my friend Bill McKibben, you folks probably know him as the person who spearheaded the 350.org effort, and also the effort to divest fossil fuel holdings, academic institutions and other institutions. He has sort of also promoted this, this principle that these companies are, in a sense, bad investments because they have on their balance sheets hundreds of millions of dollars of assets that they are not going to be able to exploit, because we will act on this problem before, the Stone Age didn't end for want of stones, and the fossil fuel age will not end for want of fossil fuels. It'll end because we will move on soon enough. So I think sometimes they want to talk a good game. Rex Tillerson, as the CEO of ExxonMobil, certainly was implicated in funding efforts to delay action on climate change, to sort of discredit renewable energy, to attack the science of climate change. So to some extent, ExxonMobil has been talking out of both sides of their corporate mouth, and it behooves them to do that. I think some of that is greenwashing, but there is a recognition there as well that we will move on, and they need to make sure that they position themselves so when that does happen, they don't get completely left behind. Yeah, I'll try to keep my answers shorter so it's more like a conversation. Yeah, yeah, please.
I'm Tran. I go to this law school near here. My question is more about development. So one of the right now, big polluters of the environment is India and China. They're a developing country. So the world is putting pressure on them to reduce their carbon emission. But their argument is that, well, the US and Europe had all the 1800s and 1900s to burn up all the coal they needed to develop and industrialize. Now we're industrializing. It's not fair that you're stopping our growth because you had your fair share of burning and now you're telling us to stop. So how do we make it fair for them to still be able to develop, because you need coal to industrialize, but at the same time not pollute the whole planet? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, this it sort of gets at the very center of the challenge that we face here, and that we have the industrial world that has profited from 2 centuries of free access to dirty energy, which we know has come with a real cost, damage to our environment, climate change. And you have developing countries who would seem to have a reasonable argument that, look, you had your, turn at the spigot. Don't we deserve the opportunity to grow our economies with cheap energy? It's a difficult argument to take issue with unless we engage in the actions necessary to sort of level the playing field. And this is part of why part of the the Paris Agreement, an important sort of part of the agreement is the industrial world providing resources to the developing world to help them sort of leapfrog, right? It's, we want to help you get to where the modern energy economy is. Fossil fuels are an antiquated energy technology. The energy technology of this century is clean energy, is renewable energy. And those countries that get out in front are the ones who are going to prosper. And actually China, interestingly enough, is well ahead of us. They are spending far more on renewable energy, to the point where they've flooded the global market with cheap solar panels, to the point where Donald Trump has had to slap a tariff on those solar panels to stop them from coming into the US, because his friends in the coal industry and the fossil fuel industry don't like that competition. So China is actually ahead of the commitment they made in the bilateral agreement with the US under Obama, which ultimately laid the groundwork for Paris, where they agreed to certain cuts over the next several decades, the US bringing their emissions to a peak and bringing them down, China sort of bringing their emissions to a plateau, with the recognition that they're not as far along in their fossil fuel economy as we are. So there was sort of this deal that you guys will bring your emissions to a peak by 2030, and in fact they're ahead of that commitment. China is actually now decommissioning coal-fired power plants. And you could make an argument that they've seen the face of environmental degradation. If you've ever been to Beijing and you've experienced the air quality issues, they're paying the price. I mean, in terms of healthcare, they are paying the price of environmental degradation, and so they sort of get it. They understand this problem, I sometimes think, in a way that our elected representatives don't. So China is sort of doing more than they had promised. It's the US now that's the skunk at the garden party, right? Because every country in the world has signed on to the Paris Accord, with the one exception of Donald Trump, who wants to pull out of Paris, and as I sometimes allude to, he seems to have a problem with pulling out. And he has threatened to pull out of the Paris Accord. It turns out it doesn't even matter. Donald Trump can say anything he wants. If you look at what's happening at the state level, if you look at what the West Coast states are doing, New England states, including Massachusetts, now joined by Virginia, thanks to my friend Terry McAuliffe, who laid the groundwork for that, and New Jersey. We are likely to meet our obligations under Paris, whether or not Trump formally pulls out of the Paris Agreement. But who are we to lecture the developing world if we don't have our own house in order? So that's why it's so important for us to display some moral leadership. We're the ones who built our economy. I'm from the state of Pennsylvania. There is no greater example of a fossil fuel state than the state of Pennsylvania, where oil was discovered in this country, where the economy was built on coal, and now, of course, with natural gas figuring prominently in the economy of the state. So, my basic response is we have to have our own house in order. We have to display some moral leadership here if we are to convince the rest of the world that we can help them leapfrog. You don't need to go through, the fossil fuel era. Because we have, this more sensible technology. You don't have to build an electrical grid. You can, we now have decentralized energy. And the challenge is to help those countries skip this unnecessary developmental state of a fossil fuel energy economy. It's not necessary in today's world. We've got better technology. As my colleague Richard Alley likes to point out, we used to get our energy from burning whale oil back in the 19th century, and something better came along, fossil fuels. Well, something better's come along now. It's renewable energy. And the countries that recognize that are the ones who are going to lead in the sort of economic race of the 21st century. So I think that's the important message. And with India, that's particularly important. Like I said, China's actually, and again, when Trump threatened to pull out of Paris, China realized that they had this ace to play in the game, which was now they could, again, take the sort of moral leadership on this issue. A country that's been criticized for some of its policies had an opportunity now to be a moral leader by taking a leadership position and acting on climate at the very time that the U.S. was threatening again to try to sabotage the agreement. So India is a little more complicated. They're not as far along economically. They have huge starvation and malnutrition problems, a very low standard of living, and it's very attractive to them. The idea that that they can bring their economy along by burning coal and cheap fossil fuels. That's where it's really critical that we help them again skip past that stage. I don't know if anybody has seen the sequel to An Inconvenient Truth, an inconvenient sequel. I actually reviewed the movie for the journal Nature, and Al Gore and his folks were so nervous about climate change contrarians and fossil fuel industry groups getting a hold of an early copy of their film that they didn't do what filmmakers will often do. They'll send you a code and you can watch it. If you're going to review it, you can watch it on your computer. They refused to do that, so I had to sit in an empty theater in Pittsburgh watching this. It was like Mystery Science Theater, 3,000. It was just me and my popcorn and Al Gore in this movie. But one of the more profound parts of that movie is where Al Gore is trying to broker this deal. India's threatening to pull out of the agreement. Al Gore is trying to broker this deal between Elon Musk and India to get Solar City to provide their intellectual capital at no cost, their solar energy capital. And those are the sorts of that's the sort of creative deal making that's probably necessary to bring along the developing world. I mean, there do need to be some reparations made from the industrial world to the developing world because of the inequity. There are all sorts of inequities when it comes to the climate change issue. That's one of them. I talked today about the intergenerational inequities, the fact that we today are mortgaging the planet for future generations who have had absolutely no role in creating this problem. So whether it's intergenerational or the disparities between the developing world and the industrial world, ethics is at the very core of this issue, and it is a social justice issue, as I think you were alluding to earlier. That was another long answer. Yeah, sure.
I have a question. So just as I consider myself a climate activist, and I belong to 350 Berkshires, 350 Mass Berkshires, and we do lobbying at the State House for legislation and also working in our towns. And I struggle with where to put my energies. How can I be most effective? And so I'm kind of just curious to hear your thoughts on, you've traveled a lot and seen a lot of things, like what kinds of successes you've seen, and should we be, should I work more on legislation? I know we have to work and in our towns, but what you might have seen other states accomplish. And again, you're from Pennsylvania, so you've seen, I don't know.
Yeah, well, there are many different Pennsylvanias. It's a complex state.
So, yeah, just your thoughts on activism and basically what the kinds of successes and things you've seen where we might learn from where you've seen successes, where to put some energy.
Yeah, there are things that we can all do voluntarily to decrease our environmental footprint, our carbon footprint, and we should all do those things and encourage our friends and family and neighbors to do them as well, set a good example for other people, and that's part of the solution, personal choices that we can make. But we can't, neither you nor I can pass a carbon tax. We can't create cap and trade systems in our states. We need elected representatives who will represent our interests rather than the fossil fuel interests who too often fund their campaigns. And we've seen what happens when people become complacent and they don't turn out to vote. You get what we have right now. You get a president who's a climate change denier. You get a Congress that's led by fossil fuel lobbyists and climate change deniers. You get a cabinet that's staffed with fossil fuel lobbyists and people like Scott Pruitt who are trying to destroy the very administration, the EPA, that he's supposed to be shepherding. That's what happens when people don't turn out to vote. And one thing that has inspired me is this renewed activism among our youth. Millennials are overwhelmingly on the right side of all these issues. They're so much more enlightened than we are, with one exception. They haven't been enlightened when it comes to their cynicism about politics. The cynicism that has kept them home and not had them voting in these elections. I think they now get it. I think these high school kids get it. They're not ready to vote, but they're actually trying to get their parents to sign petitions, which is remarkable. They've just been so ingenious in the way they've gone about that. And I think millennials and the younger generation that coming up behind them get it, and they understand now that you can't be disengaged from our political system. They understand what happens when you become disengaged. You get the ridiculous policies that we have when it comes to access to assault weapons. And so I think what's happened is that event, I think that's a galvanizing event, just like the Cuyahoga River catching on fire in 1970s. Incidentally, the 50-year anniversary is next summer, and there will be a lot of outreach around that event. And the legacy of that was we got the EPA from Richard Nixon. We got the Clean Air Acts and the Clean Water Acts. I think we're going through a similar tipping point moment right now on guns, and we've seen a tipping point on marriage equality in the recent past. And so what that tells us is these tipping points will happen. You have to keep on pushing forward, and you don't know when it's going to happen. And you don't know what the ultimate payoff is going to be about those efforts. Marriage equality didn't happen in an instant. It was decades of organizing that led to us finally getting to the point where we were ready for that transition. And the same thing is true here with regard to environmental sustainability and climate change. So what that means, what we can do, get out to vote, get out and convince other people that they have to vote, and capitalize on this amazing energy that we have now coming from young folks. This is an amazing opportunity. They're getting re-engaged in our politics. Let's build on that. Let's help them do that. Let's support them in their efforts to do that. Organizing, getting out, raising awareness, doing everything we can to make sure that we elect representatives who will do the right thing rather than the profitable thing. Question here? Yeah.
Kathy Dealey, unaffiliated nature lover.
Nothing wrong with that.
A couple of years ago, the Department of Defense released a very high-level report stating, it's actually extremely readable, stating that climate change was real and that it was a national security issue. So when I heard about that, I thought, wow, this is going to be great because, the Department of Defense is going to need funding in order to move naval bases and various other things like that. So they're going to be talking to members of Congress and industry leaders, et cetera. And I wondered whether you've seen anything that came out of that report. Has it been instrumental in changing people's minds or moving the target a little further?
Yeah, so I mean, Secretary Mattis, for example, in the Trump administration, is actually on the right side of this issue and has actually pushed back against some of the efforts within the administration to in particular, there was a revisiting of sort of our official national security policies on carbon and climate. And there was an effort by some in the Trump administration to sort of remove that language and remove that from the mission. And there was pushback from Mattis and others within the national security community because they take this very seriously. And what's interesting is that they have been somewhat immune to the sort of anti-science and anti-environmentalism that pervades the Trump administration. There is enough bureaucracy, and they're wily enough and smart enough to know how to defend that turf. And so we still have very climate-friendly national security policies, despite the Trump administration's stance on this issue. There was the report I think you're referring to. There was a report some years ago called Age of Consequences, which actually refers to a quote Winston Churchill. But in this case, the threat not being this rising tide of fascism in Europe in the 1940s, it's this the threat that climate change poses to national security. And you may remember, I think it was during the election, or maybe it was after he was elected, I can't remember, Trump said something like, and I referred to this in my talk today, said, we shouldn't be distracted with, these, non-issues like climate change. We need to be focused on international terrorism, the things that really matter. There's a deep fallacy, right, behind that sort of statement, because the national security community recognizes that climate change is what they call a threat multiplier. It takes existing tensions for resource competition for water and land and food, with a growing global population that creates conflict. And take ISIS, for example. Let's understand the context in which ISIS arose. Syria is at an unprecedented drought, the worst drought in at least 900 years, as far back as the paleoclimate scientists can go. That drought forced rural farmers into the cities where they were competing with the people who already lived there for food and water and space. That created an atmosphere of conflict in which the terrorist organization that we know as ISIS arose. Now, it might be a stretch to say climate change caused ISIS, but clearly, the national security community recognizes that climate change is creating an atmosphere where organizations like ISIS can prosper. And so you know, even, you know, and if you look at the, you know, the melting of the Arctic sea ice, that's opening up a new coastline that countries have to defend now, and there are going to be wars over access to the oil. So, you know, it isn't the national security community, you know, these aren't granola crunching, you know, environmental activists. These are some of the, one of the most conservative sort of communities in our society, and yet they understand the bottom line, just like the business community gets it. You know, this is coming at a great cost when it comes to, you know, even, you know, leading, you know, companies recognize that climate change is a threat to their bottom line as well. But the national security community is a really important one because they speak to an audience that won't necessarily listen to NGOs and environmental groups or, you know, ivory tower professors like myself. But you get a 4-star general talking to them. You get the head of the Pentagon, you know, talking to them. They listen. And I think that's sort of part of why we are making progress here. You know, because the impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. People get it. This is a problem. We're reaping already the damage that we've sown. Yeah, you were raise your hand before.
My name's Irvine Sobelman. I live in Northampton, and I'm a part of Climate Action Now and Sugar Shack Alliance, and newly the Poor People's Campaign, which includes a call for increased climate concern. Everybody's been asking a lot of policy questions. I actually have a climate science question. I read recently just a little blurb, I can't remember where, about some recent research and call for more research on the Gulf Stream and the Atlantic
Meridional overturning circulation, AMOC.
Right. And I wondered if you had anything to say about that.
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting. The Paris studies that just appeared in Nature this week, and a very close colleague of mine was a co-author on one of them. One of them actually used paleoclimate information to sort of assess the slowdown that we've seen in the AMOC, in the conveyor belt ocean circulation. If you saw the movie The Day After Tomorrow, it's sort of a caricature of what the science has. But
what is AMOC?
It's the technical term is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. It's the ocean conveyor belt. It's this warm current. The Gulf Stream is sort of part of it, although most of the Gulf Stream is actually a wind-driven current system that recirculates, but part of the Gulf Stream doesn't recirculate. It travels north into the North Atlantic, delivering heat to the high latitudes and keeping places like Europe and eastern Canada, coastal Canada, warmer than they would otherwise be. It also is associated, in part at least, with the great biological productivity of the North Atlantic Ocean. It's associated with convection, the mixing of water masses, which brings nutrients to the surface, and it's part of why the North Atlantic is one of the most, if not the most productive fisheries in the world. And we rely upon, again, you know, a growing global population, and if we see diminishing, you know, fish stocks, that's a real problem. 25% of the world is primary source of nutrition or protein is actually seafood, and so if this circulation were to collapse, that could spell problems, for example, for the health of our fisheries. It actually would lead, it turns out, for subtle scientific reasons, to even faster sea level rise along the east coast of the U.S. So we actually published a study 3 years ago in the journal Nature Geoscience using paleoclimate information to show that this circulation pattern was slowing and that the slowing down during the past century was anomalous in the context of the past 1,000 years. The study that appeared in Nature this week came to the same conclusion. It was more using slightly different data, and it got more coverage than our study. But that conclusion isn't a new conclusion. It's something we've known for some time. In fact, over the last few years, if you look at global patterns of sea surface temperature, the oceans have been the warmest on record, and it's part of why we've had these unprecedented hurricanes. And yet, there's this patch we call the cold blob in the North Atlantic, south of Greenland, that has had the coldest temperatures on record. And it turns out that that is a direct fingerprint for a slowing down of this ocean circulation pattern. It's an example of what we call a tipping point. The physics of this, in fact, I lecture to my 400 level class in climate dynamics. We go through some of the simple conceptual physical models. A great oceanographer, Henry Stommel, back in the 1960s, using a model of the global oceans that consists of two boxes with two pipes connecting them. And they differ in their salinity and temperature, and you can have two different types of circulation. And he showed, remarkably, that that simple system exhibits tipping point behavior. It can be in the mode that it has been historically, where we have a strong Gulf Stream that delivers heat poleward in the North Atlantic. You add a little bit of fresh water, and you lighten the water, you can inhibit the sinking motion that helps drive that circulation. The models, the climate models, predicted that we might see that over the next century. Our study, and now other studies are backing that up, is that no, we don't have to wait to the next century. We're seeing that already. Why might that be ahead of schedule? What else is ahead of schedule in the observations relative to the models? The melting of Greenland. The melting of Greenland is happening earlier. The loss of ice from the two major ice sheets is happening earlier. And we understand some of the physics now of why that might be happening, physics that weren't in our climate models. So when, politicians say that the climate scientists are alarmists, that we're overestimating the problem, if anything, we've been too conservative. Our models have been too conservative in the sense that there are things that are happening in the real world that aren't in the models that, unfortunately, can act in a way to accelerate these changes relative to what we had predicted. And so these things are happening earlier, and the loss of Greenland ice is happening earlier. That means the flow of that fresh water into the North Atlantic is happening earlier. That means that the shutdown in this ocean circulation pattern is happening earlier. When we published this study 3 years ago, there was still a lot of skepticism among our colleagues that this is really the correct interpretation of what we're seeing with these two new studies in Nature. I think we are now seeing this is how a scientific consensus emerges. It isn't one study, like our 3-year-old study. I don't blame our colleagues. We had one study that suggested this was happening that differed with sort of the conventional wisdom. But now you have this growing body of research, and when the IPCC publishes its next report and it assesses the collective evidence, it will look at the collective evidence as now supporting the notion that this is happening earlier. And so uncertainty is not our friend. Any politicians who tell you that uncertainty, scientific uncertainty, is a reason for inaction, the truth is just the opposite. Uncertainty is not our friend. It's a reason to act even sooner because of the possibility, the distinct possibility, in fact, increasingly the probability that the changes are going to happen sooner and they're going to be greater than what we had predicted just decades ago. Question in the back here? Yep.
Glaciology, geology, geochemistry, things like that all my life.
Yeah.
I appreciate your work, actually.
Thank you.
It appeared on my radar when that paper came out. Back in '98, was it?
With a hockey stick article, it will be 2 decades old on Earth Day. You might see some publications about that. Yeah.
I have a lot of questions, but I want to focus on one, maybe a little bit, and maybe you can provide some personal anecdotes on this. Is there's sort of a, do you see the physical earth sciences, oceanic, terrestrial, atmospheric, having to stretch, the climate change problem is forcing them to stretch into each other's domains.
Yep.
It's an innovation, right? And I would like to, and it's an essential innovation because we have to start thinking and acting like the planet. That's the challenge.
Right.
Right. To us. I'd like you to speak on what you observe about that, and what you think that, like, is the National Science Foundation on this? Are we moving in that direction to have a more integrated view? And also, in that, part of that integration is being a citizen, which of course you've been at the forefront of. And I'd like you to speak about the role of the scientist who has to be dispassionate, to be objective, versus actually being a citizen who actually has the data and the information that the world needs to hear.
Okay, thanks. So great questions. I'll try to I want to leave time for other questions, and so I'll try to be as efficient as possible in answering them. The first question. So, you know, I was part of this diaspora back in the early 1990s. I was a physicist. I was doing a PhD in physics, and there was these emerging opportunities to move into this field of climate science, where if you had skills in physics and math, there was this sort of relatively wide open sort of frontier in science where you could come in and make real progress and contribute to the forefront of knowledge. And so that was the point in which climate change was starting to become multidisciplinary. Multidisciplinary just means you've got people coming from different disciplines into that field. It's not the mature stage of what you really need, which is interdisciplinary science. You actually need people from those different areas of science communicating to each other in language that they each understand. And that has taken a while to mature, but I would say that what we now have when it comes to the science of climate is truly interdisciplinary system science, where you have leading biologists and chemists and physicists and economists and and ethicists and everything else, because this problem impacts every sort of dimension of our existence. It's a problem of science. It's a problem of economics. It's a problem of politics and policy. It's a problem of ethics. There was some talk about the arts, the role of the arts. That's part of the communication challenge. We need people from the humanities and the arts who can help us find novel ways to communicate this problem, especially when we are communicating not in a vacuum, but against this stiff, headwind of a concerted disinformation effort. So that we have now reached the point where I do think that there is an interdisciplinary spirit in climate research, and not just on the science side of it, but in understanding the ethical dimensions and communicating the science to the public and every other dimension of the problem, which sort of leads to the second question, the role of the scientist in our public discourse. And early on in my career, and I talk about this in my book, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars. I remember I started out as a physicist and having this view that the role of the scientist stopped at the laboratory door. You published the paper, and you let other people figure out what to do with that. That's a very naive physicist way of looking at the world. In some ways it's an endearing way of, it's almost adorable in its naivety. But I was sort of unique in that when we published the hockey stick article back in the late 1990s, I was thrust into the public sphere when our work was attacked, and I had to defend myself against these attacks and had to become more effective at communicating to defend myself. But in the process of doing that, realized that I had a larger obligation and opportunity here to use that that position that provided me to try to influence this larger conversation. And so a few years ago, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. It's outside their paywall, so you can check it out. It's called "If You See Something, Say Something." And of course, that comes from our Department of Homeland Security. But my argument in the piece is that I'm articulating the point that this applies to us as scientists paid by the taxpayer, in many cases, to study this problem. It would be, we would be relegating our responsibility to not report to the public in as clear and objective terms as we can the implications of what we're finding. And furthermore, if we don't do that, we leave behind a vacuum that will be filled by other voices of those who have special interest, who have an agenda to advance. And so I end up arguing that it is the role of the scientific community collectively to make sure that our policy debate is informed by an objective and accurate understanding of what the science has to say about the risks that are involved. I don't necessarily see it as my place to try to dictate what the form of the solution, and there are people from Citizens Climate Lobby here, I know, who have articulated one vision of how we can tackle this problem, a vision that's actually attractive to many conservatives. Revenue neutral carbon taxes are a way to tackle the problem. without raising taxation overall. You know, there's a worthy political debate to be had about how we solve this problem, but there isn't a worthy debate to be had about whether the problem exists and whether the risks exist. And it is incumbent upon the scientific community to make sure that that's the starting point for any, you know, debate about policy. What I argue is that it's fully appropriate as a scientist for your views about policy relevance and your views about the importance of communication being informed by the science that you do. The fact that I'm studying firsthand the risks posed by climate change arguably puts me in a special position to inform this discussion. What would be wrong, what would go against sort of the cultural norms of science would be if my policy views somehow influenced the results of my science, the way I did the science. I think that that's the firewall that we don't want to allow to be breached. It's a one-way firewall. The science can certainly inform our views of policy and risk. But our views of risk and policy shouldn't dictate the results of our science. And I like to think that I have been true to that principle and that the vast majority of my colleagues have been. There are times when you might question whether that, you know, whether there is that objectivity. It's always a danger. It's a challenging one-way firewall to deal with. Yeah, thanks. Question back here, and then, yeah.
I'm Dana Drugman. I'm a reporter. I write for the Berkshire Edge and also climate liability news.
Great.
So my question actually is, I've been covering the climate lawsuits and litigation that we're seeing. So my question is about that. What role do you think the courts have to play now, especially in the era of Trump when the Congress and executive branch aren't doing their job? So we're seeing, for those of you who don't know, a bunch of cities in California are suing the fossil fuel companies to try to get them to help pay for the costs of adapting to climate change, building seawalls, and that. San Francisco and Oakland, they actually had a climate science tutorial last month where the actual science was in the courtroom, and they had the plaintiffs present their witnesses presenting the science, and then the oil companies had one lawyer up there basically saying that they accept the science, the IPCC report, but they heavily emphasize the uncertainties and try to escape any accountability.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering what your take on all of that is, and also the Our Children's Trust lawsuit is a part of that, and that's going to trial later this year, October 29th. Actually, they just got a trial date.
Yeah, I'm originally brought forward by my colleague James Hansen, former director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, otherwise known as the government science building above Tom's Diner of Seinfeld fame in the Upper West Side. I actually did a sabbatical there for half a year. So went to the Seinfeld restaurant for work every day, or the little side door over next to it. So, you know, historically, you know, much of our progress when it comes to social movements has taken place in the courts, which have often been sort of ahead of where the rest of our politics is. And we like to think that the courts, that there are rules of engagement in the court system that give special value and salience to facts. And in a world today where people feel entitled to alternative facts and favor true fake news rather than the legitimate news which they would like to dismiss as fake news. Very clever to sort of turn things around. So the courts, you know, when it comes to the civil rights movement, desegregation, you know, much of the social progress has come through our court system. It would be sort of surprising if that weren't the case here as well. And so I certainly support those efforts. I think both of them are important. I think science has a real advantage in the courtroom. more so in the courtroom than in the court of public opinion. It's more difficult for the special interests to game the courtroom than game the court of public opinion through millions of dollars of advertising and disinformation campaigns. So I think that those are important developments. Some of my colleagues, a close friend of mine, colleague of mine from the University of Illinois, Don Werbles, was one of the two scientists who presented the pro-science case. And the industry, it was sort of schizophrenic, because on the one hand, they didn't want to completely concede. You know, you can say I accept the science, but when you're downplaying when you're downplaying the level of confidence in the science, when you're exaggerating the level of uncertainty, you're really not accepting the science. You're looking for a way out from accepting what the overwhelming majority of the world's scientists have to say. So they wanted to have it both ways. They didn't want to give up without contesting in some way sort of the very stark nature of the scientific evidence, because it is stark enough that it implies the need to, for action. But at the same time, then they wanted to absolve themselves of culpability by saying, well, we're just making this product available to the people. What the people choose to buy, well, we've heard that argument before. We've heard that argument from the junk food industry. We've heard it before from polluting interests. It's a tried and true sort of way of evading responsibility for one's corporate actions. So I'm pretty optimistic that that these cases will lead us somewhere useful at a time when we're battling to make progress, in the rest of our political system, with an executive branch run by climate change denying Republicans and a Congress that at least for the next 200 and some days is controlled by climate change denying Republicans. Question here, yeah.
As one of the token millennials in the room, I just have I have a question about activism. Bringing it back down to earth on a more personal level. For me, one of the ways that I've become an environmentalist, or am becoming an environmentalist, is through civic action, which started entirely accidentally opposing a very bad development idea in downtown Great Barrington, and has sort of grown from that. And I was not raised with civics as part of my life.
Yeah.
And I'm homeschooled, and then I went to private schools. It's not like I come from any sort of poverty issue, just scrounging for money, right? But civics are so far divorced from just how we live our lives. One of the ways that I've been trying to evolve as an activist and an environmentalist is to getting to know the place where I live, which is through botany and ethnobotany and learning about nature in a very particular way, which then applies to me as a person in my town. And yeah, my cynicism about the national political situation is high, very high, to the point that I'm not even sure if we're ever going to change it. Maybe it just needs to blow up and we'll start all over again.
Well, and that was the danger of that thinking leads us down the road to Trumpism.
I know. I'm fully aware, and it makes basically everyone in this room think when I say things like that.
No, I knew you understood. Yeah.
So I'm curious what your thoughts are about bringing activism and climate talk down to a really personal, not the world is going to explode in a burning ball of fire, because basically then we just all throw up our hands because we can't do anything about that, right?
Yeah.
So.
You were at my talk today.
No,
you weren't. Oh, okay. I thought so. I talked about precisely that. I think Franklin, D. Roosevelt once famously said, "The greatest thing we have to fear is fear itself," and he was talking about the self-fulfilling nature of fear and how it influences the economy negatively. The same thing can be said of the climate challenge. One of the greatest threats that we face is the unjustified belief that the problem is unsolvable, that we're beyond the tipping point, that there's nothing we can do. There's one very prominent sort of personality within the climate movement, who I don't name because I don't feel I have to. You can Google and figure out who I'm talking about if you really want. But he's made a name for himself by proclaiming that we are doomed as a species, and all life on Earth is doomed, and it's going to happen within 10 years, and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, if you truly believe that that's the case, well, that leads you down the same path of inaction as outright denial. I see it as every bit as destructive. It would be one thing if there was an iota of scientific evidence for that viewpoint, but there isn't. And I sometimes wonder, if there are folks on the other side who are, and we know how this works now, we saw what happened in this last election, who are in a very mischievous way sort of cultivating that sort of thinking as an additional sort of axis in their effort to suppress action on climate. So I do think there's a real danger there. I can understand the cynicism, that in the millennial generation, it just seems, there are times when it seems, gun control, for example, is a very good example. I mean, if Sandy Hook wasn't enough, what on God's earth could be enough to affect action? And the moral outrage that comes with the idea that we can allow an event like that to happen and still not act, and that people who would call themselves our elected representatives could possibly defy their moral obligation to do something. That legitimately leads to cynicism and disgust. And yet, as I alluded to earlier, I think that's all changing. And for reasons that are sort of interesting, these elementary school kids don't have a voice. They can't speak, and they don't have the sorts of skills and acumen that these high school students have. And these high school students have grown up in the world of social media, in a world where communication is part of your upbringing. And so they have a step up on, on the lobbyists and the fossil fuel PR representatives, or in this case the NRA and their PR people. Millions of dollars of advertising can't compete with the effectiveness that with which they have brought their case forward. Just the eloquence, the cleverness in terms of the way they have worked the media. This idea of, okay, well, I can't vote, but I can demand that my parents sign this petition to not vote for somebody who doesn't support common sense gun legislation. So it's a shame that Sandy Hook wasn't enough to bring that about. But this does seem to be changing the game. And I do think we're going through a cultural tipping point. And we know these things happen. It happened on marriage equality. Nobody can deny that. That was a major change in our social fabric that took place very rapidly, but because of all the work that had gone into it for years. I think that's what we're going through right now with guns. I think part of why Democrats will retake the House of Representatives, and maybe the Senate too, will be because of this issue. The NRA always had guns as an issue that worked to their benefit. It's now boomeranged on them. And that's a game changer. And once they lose that stranglehold, then politicians start to question, well, why should I, mindlessly support the NRA when it didn't help me in my, it's not helping my colleagues. So we can, and I think what I hope is true of high school students and millennials as they prevail in this battle, and I think they will recognize the power that they wield. And they will deploy that power and the moral authority that they carry with them to change the world in other ways. I think that you're the millennial. You can speak better to what your do you feel that is, do you see that?
I do. I think it's really important when our civic functions and as small as town hall
Yep.
meetings are opened up and we are invited in.
Yep.
That for me, that was a really profound thing when after a town hall meeting for a planning board, which was run by Robert's Rules, which I had no idea what anyone was saying half the time. When I was invited to go out and get a beer after and was introduced into how this worked and how you actually made change happen, and we did actually make change happen. So that lowers my cynicism.
Yeah. Well, special interests are really good at AstroTurf, at creating the appearance of broad-based support.
Yeah.
But they can't actually produce bodies. They can't produce human beings. They do their best to bus in their employees to events and protests. But when people turn out, they don't stand a chance. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I know that in California they have a lot of sun, so they can use renewable energy, including solar panels and solar energy. But here we don't have access to that kind of energy. So what kinds of things can we use in our homes that can be renewable energy?
It's a great question, and it's a little, it's surprising actually how much sunlight you really need for solar energy to be, cost efficient. There was a Fox News talking head. This was a couple years ago. I remember watching this, and she was sort of articulating the case against renewable energy in the U.S. And the person that she was, debating with said, well, look at Germany. Look at how much 30% of their electricity is generated from solar. And then the Fox News talking head, she said, oh yeah, well, Germany has all that sun. If you've ever been to Germany, no, they're a higher latitude and at least as much cloud cover as we tend to have, here in the Northeast and in the U.S. in general. So no, we actually have, solar energy is more viable in the United States in the lower 48 than it is in Germany, and Germany's making a go of it. So no, I mean, solar, some combination of solar, wind, geothermal. There's this effort called the Climate Solutions Project. A good friend of mine, Mark Jacobson of Stanford, has sort of spearheaded that from the academic side, but one of his partners is another friend of mine who you know as the Incredible Hulk, Mark Ruffalo, and they've been sort of, they've gone around and they've looked at every state, and they have plans for each state that looks at the resources within that state, that looks at the viability of each part of that portfolio. And they have a plan which, very clearly depicts the possibility of us meeting 100% of our electricity demand from renewables within, a time frame of a couple decades. It takes time to build up all that infrastructure, and it's not going to happen if we don't invest in it now. So no, we can do it. We know, people like Bill Gates, frustratingly, say things like, we need a miracle. We need a breakthrough. No, we don't. We already have the solution. We just have to invest in it. It's called renewable energy. And as I said before, the countries that get out in front in that transition are the ones that are going to lead the global economy. So, yeah, we can do it here in Massachusetts. We can do it Pennsylvania. We get all of our power from wind. We have a plan. You can pay a little bit extra, and your power all comes from wind. I have a hybrid, but my next car, and in fact my wife's car that she's planning on buying, we've got about a year left with our Subaru before it gives up the ghost. And there's something to be said for sort of running the wheels into the ground from a carbon standpoint. But Subaru is coming out with a plug-in hybrid. So the plug-in hybrid, you're getting your power from wind. You're charging your car with the power, from your home. That's coming from wind as well. So your transportation is driven by the wind, and your power as well. So we can do it. It's there. We just have to. We need policies that incentivize that transition. And right now we're dependent on fossil fuels, which have this huge cost. take this huge toll in terms of the damage being done by climate change. As Bill McKibben, again, my friend Bill McKibben has eloquently put it, we've given the fossil fuel industry the greatest incentive of any industry. It's allowed to dump its waste into our atmosphere at no cost. And so we have to internalize that cost. There needs to be a price signal, a price on carbon. Carbon tax, cap and trade, explicit sort of incentives for renewable. There are lots of ways to do that, but we have to level the playing field so that those sources of energy, renewable energy, that aren't damaging the planet in the same way can compete on a level playing field with renewable energy. They're already starting to outcompete fossil fuels even without that incentive. If we can introduce those incentives and level the playing field, we will accelerate a transition that's already underway. So thanks for that question. It's a really good one. Question back here? Yeah.
I might just throw in a plug. I literally a couple of weeks ago got a hybrid plug-in of Prius, Toyota Prius Prime, and it's delightful.
Yeah.
Like I plug it into my garage in a regular outlet. I can go a week without using a gallon of gas.
Yeah.
Without I got 103 miles to the gallon the first week I owned it because I plugged it in every night, and all day.
Yeah.
It's not far.
No, absolutely. Now, there is something to be said. Yep. No, and there's something to be said. There are some technological, innovations that would still help. Better batteries will allow us to extend, the distances over which you can travel on a charge, and that's important. What's that?
I can do 25.
Yeah, so it would be nice to be able to go a couple hundred miles and not have to stop at a charging station for an hour. So I mean, there's no question that technology can help, improve these existing technologies. That additional innovation can improve these technologies, but you got to go with the troops that you have, and so we've got to go with the technology that exists now, while making sure that we provide incentives for research and development to improve those technologies. I mentioned the Climate Solutions Project, and those projections that we could meet, projected energy demand with 100% renewables in a matter of 2 decades are based on a really conservative assumption of only deploying existing technology. Well, we know that's a conservative assumption because there's what we call learning by doing. As you start to implement these technologies, you find new efficiencies, you develop new technology that makes it even more efficient. So that's it's a conservative estimate. If anything, there are reasons to be optimistic that we can get there even faster. Yeah, thanks.
Maybe one more question.
Okay, sure. Yeah, over here.
I'd like to blame everything on Donald Trump, but it seems like there's, and I'm just curious your perception of this. I have a sense of a reframing in the culture, which feels like a concerted effort. I have no idea where it comes from, to reframe science as an ideology, and it feels like a really tricky mortal swipe at the role of science and the voice of science. And I'm just curious if you had a perception like that and where it comes from and what to do about it.
Well, yeah.
That's a shit show if that happens.
Well, who are the primary targets? To go back to Trump, sorry, our intelligence agencies, our national security community, our scientists, our academic institutions. These are the institutions that this is sort of the last barrier in their efforts to dismantle the obstacles to I was going to say an industrytocracy. I mean, a society which is completely controlled by major corporations. That's where they'd like to go. That's what, Trump was just in my view, a useful tool for polluting interests and corporate interests to gain a foothold on our entire political system. Trump didn't really play any part in determining who was appointed to run the various agencies, Scott Pruitt was hand-selected by the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers didn't support Trump. You may remember they supported other candidates. But when they realized that Trump was likely to be the candidate, there was this unholy alliance that was reached. We won't stand in the way of your presidency. You let us appoint the members of your cabinet. And that's how we got people like Scott Pruitt and Ryan Zinke, and who are quietly now advancing this deregulatory agenda, even as the three-ring circus act that is Trump plays out. That's the shiny object that draws our attention away from all the damage that's being done when it comes to the protections for our environment, the protections for consumers. So I think they've been very clever in drawing attention away from that, and I think that they recognize that the greatest threats that stand in the way of them fully implementing that agenda are higher education, are the independence of our local radio stations and local media. Why are we seeing the massive corporate buyouts of local media outlets? The Sinclair, if people have been following that. The attacks on our national security and intelligence communities and on our scientists. Those are the institutions that stand in the way of them fully and irrevocably implementing their agenda. I think we'll win, but we are now witnessing a monumental battle for the soul of this country and for the soul of democracy, at the risk of overstating the significance of what we're seeing play out. And that's why these midterm elections are so critical. They may be the one thing standing in the way of these, these players winning in this battle. So that's why we have to turn out, even in states like Massachusetts, which, yeah.
And on that note, I just want to say thank you so much to Dr.
Thank you.